Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We've got a bunch of new cards to look at today, so I'll get started straight away. And we'll look at Gonk the Raptor, which is the Loa for Druid. He costs 7 mana, has 4 attack and 9 health. He's also a beast. And after your hero attacks and kills a minion, it may attack again. So just to explain this, Gonk has to be on the board. He doesn't attack again, it's your hero that does. So you play Gonk onto the board, then you play your hero power, you hit a minion. If a minion dies, you can hit another minion or your opponent's face with the same attack, and it kind of has mega win fury, so every time you kill a minion you can attack again. But if you attack your opponent's face, obviously you don't get that effect. I've got to say, on the face of it, I don't really think this card is very good, and the reason for that is that the effect that you're going for, building this whole deck, and the effect that you're going for is literally just an efficient board clear with your hero power, or some cards which have upgraded your hero power. So what we're talking about is killing a couple of minions, and it's also conditioned on the fact that your attack is enough to kill that minion. Is it really worth building your deck around? Probably not. What I would say is this could potentially go into an Odd Druid deck. An Odd Druid was okay in previous expansions, and maybe this and a few other cards could push that deck to be a viable one. And the other cards that synergize with this are, of course, Spirit of the Raptor. The Spirit does synergize very well because it encourages you to use your hero power to kill minions because you get to draw a card. So what cards could Druid use to increase your hero power? Well, if you're Odd Druid, then of course it's upgraded to 2 attack and gaining 2 armor. That's fantastic. You could play Gnash and Claw in that kind of Odd Druid deck, but probably the best one is an even card, which is Bite. That gives your hero plus 4 attack and 4 armor. So that would be the most efficient at doing these board clears, but you couldn't put it into an odd deck. Druid is very good at gaining armor, of course, so you could play cards such as Ferocious Howl to gain a bunch of armor, which obviously synergizes well with you attacking with your hero, because you don't want to be losing too much health with Druid. So that can work quite well, but again, if you're playing Odd, you can't play Branching Paths, which is a very flexible card, but also very good for getting armor. Another thing about Gonk the Raptor is that it does need to be on the board for the effect to trigger. So if your opponent's expecting this, they can just hold some hard removal and you'll only get 1 turn of the effect. So it does have 9 health, so it's very a survivable minion. There's not a lot that can kill it except for hard removals. And there are a couple of ways that you could help to stick this on the board more. And again, that kind of leans away from the Odd Druid. So I'm thinking Predatory Instincts is a great way to draw Gonk at double his health up to 18, and that makes him an extremely sticky minion. And also you could play it with Stampeding Roar, so you can get it out for 6 mana, and that would mean that you could play it with Bite in the same turn. So it leans into the Odd Druid, but it also leans away from the Odd Druid. So I don't quite know how this whole deck would come together eventually. Perhaps this is just an archetype they're looking at to go for in future expansions, because in this current expansion, Druid's got so many strong cards. Until the rotations happen, I'm not sure they'll be looking for other archetypes. Next, let's take a look at Boggs Lost. This is a Shaman only card, which is rare, costs 3 mana, has 3 attack and 3 health, and is an elemental. And it has the battle cry, return a friendly minion to your hand and give it +2/+2. So this can be directly compared to Zola the Gorgon, which is already played in Shadowbox Shaman. And the reason it's played in Shadowbox Shaman is it bounces a copy back into your hand. This does not bounce a copy, this bounces the actual minion off the board back into your hand, but it has the advantage of giving it +2/+2, and it also has the advantage of being a 3/3 rather than a 2/2, which Zola the Gorgon is. It also has the advantage that you can play 2 of these in your deck. It's not a legendary, and Zola the Gorgon is actually rotating out in April. So whether Boggs Lost is better than Zola the Gorgon is really debatable, because the advantage of Zola the Gorgon is that you get the 2/2 body on the board, but you also keep the minion that you've bounced back. So obvious targets are Chain Gang and Keleseth. Now, if you were to use Boggs Lost on Chain Gang or Keleseth, the minion comes off of the board, and then when you replay it, it has +2/+2. So if you did it on a Chain Gang, that would be great, because you lose the 2/3 from the board, but you gain the next turn a couple of 4/5s. Is that worth it? Probably, because you can play 2 Boggs Losts in your deck, so you could do it again. And then when you actually play your Shadow Walk, you do need the Chain Gang to go off first to create a copy of the Shadow Walk before you would then bounce one of those back to your hand. And in the case of Zola the Gorgon, it would bounce a copy of it back to your hand rather than actually just bouncing the minion off of the board. So bouncing the minion off of the board is kind of one way to get it back in your hand, but it's not as good as what Zola the Gorgon would do. However, when you play that Shadow Walk the next time, it does have +2/+2, and when it gets copied with the Chain Gangs, it does become bigger and bigger. So I think it's debatable as to whether this will replace Zola the Gorgon. I don't think it will, but Zola the Gorgon does rotate out in April. So again, this is just a way for Shadow Walk to continue past that expansion in a slightly different way. Next, let's take a look at a few priest cards. This one's called Regenerate. It's a 0 mana spell and it restores 3 health. So this is fairly unexciting. It's difficult to put 0 mana spells into your deck because it takes up 2 card slots that you could put some more powerful cards in. And also when the effect is only restoring 3 health, it's not actually that big considering your hero power can restore 2. Yes, it's a good value. 0 mana, 3 health is good value, but there are instances where restoring health just doesn't matter. Where the advantages are with this card is that it does synergize very well with Lyra the Sunshard, so it gives you 0 mana spells to be able to trigger Lyra. But also you could potentially not put this in your deck, and it's a nice spell to get from Lyra because if you generate it, it only costs 0 mana, so you could probably get a nice use out of it, and then it will generate another spell from Lyra. So I really kind of see that as the best way. There are some other implications with this with Arcanized Soul Priest, because when you play that, it changes your healing effects into damage. So 0 mana, deal 3 damage is very, very strong. That is a really good play. But it's difficult. There's already lots of ways to play Priest with Malygos to get extra damage with Holy Smite, for example. Will it be easy enough to get an Arcanized Soul Priest on the board and Malygos to be able to play Regenerate? I don't know. I think that would be quite tough. So it's something that maybe you would want to put in that. It could work in a Xeric's Cloning Gallery deck to be able to do that. But honestly, outside of that, I think this is a card you're going to get randomly off of Lyra the Sunshard. This next priest spell is a better spell in my opinion than the previous one, and because it has more uses. This is called Seance. It does cost 2 mana, and then choose a minion, add a copy of it to your hand. This can be really, really quite good. It's a low cost spell that when discounted can work really well with Lyra. Even at 2 mana it works quite well with Lyra because you could just copy Lyra and bring it back to your hand. That's pretty decent. It's a copy, it does not return that minion to your hand, so that's pretty strong. So again, you can compare it to Zola the Gorgon. It costs 1 mana less and you don't get the 2/2 body. So actually, I think between the two cards, I would rather play Seance because it has more synergies in Priest. We've seen the new card called Grave Horror that wants you to play a lot of low-cost spells. So not only playing this spell could discount a Grave Horror, but once the Grave Horror has been discounted, you can play the Grave Horror and then play a Seance on it and bring a copy of it back to play again. If you've already reduced it to 0 mana, you could do that and you could have a couple of Seances in your hand and make these really strong tempo plays. It's also really good with Amara. It's cheaper to use than Zola the Gorgon to bring Amara back to your hand. And you can have 2 copies in your deck, so that's 3 Amaras you could have to restore your health to 40. A really easy way to do that. It's also better than Zola in the way that you could choose an enemy minion and bring it back to your hand. So if there's a particularly good enemy minion that you either can't get in Priest or is very situationally very good for you, for 2 mana you could have that in your hand to be able to play on the same turn or the next turn after. And a final bit of synergy, which is quite cool, this will work really well with Princess Talanji because adding a copy of a minion to your hand means that it didn't start in your deck. So you can take enemy minions, put them in your hand, you can take your own minions, put them in your hand, and then you play Talanji and those come out. So it's just a 2 mana way of getting a huge kind of tempo plus to your Talanji. So I like it, I think it's good, I think you would play it in a Talanji deck, I think you may be able to squeeze it into a Quest Priest deck. It's a really nice spell to get from Lyra randomly, so a good addition to Priest. This next Priest card I think is pretty good. It's called Sandridge. It costs 3 mana, has 3 attack and 3 health. So a nice minion just to play on the board as a 3 mana 3/3 if you have to. But whenever you cast a spell, you summon a 1/1 zombie with Taunt. Now, that doesn't seem that special, but it's very similar to a Violet Teacher, which is often played in token decks to be able to generate these small tokens. Now, the downside with Priest is that they don't really have many synergies with tokens. They don't have ways to buff huge boards. They can buff individual minions though, so having 1/1 tokens that you can put an extra arms onto, for example, could be pretty decent. Also, 1/1 taunt minions can be pretty annoying for your opponent to remove, and they will protect your Sandridge to be able to keep generating value turn after turn, and those 1/1 taunt minions could protect your Radiant Elementals, for example, to be able to discount your spells to create more and more. So you can see how you can start generating some value. There are some sort of hidden synergies with Priest here. You know, if you did have a lot of these on the board and you wanted to play Psychic Scream, that could be really good because then your opponent's stuffed with 1 mana 1/1 taunts. That could be a really good use for it. It also has a bit of synergy kind of in certain situations with Spirit Lash. If you're really struggling for health and you had a bunch of opponents' minions on the board and you cast a few spells, you can get a few 1/1s which will also heal you up a little bit when you play Spirit Lash. I think that's a bit of a less of a synergy, but it is quite important in Priest sometimes. So a nice little card which doesn't have amazing synergies with Priest, but I think it would mostly be used to summon these small token minions that can protect other minions, such as your Nausea Clerics to help you draw cards, your Radiant Elementals to help you reduce your spells, maybe even Lyra the Sunshard it will protect for a few turns. Pretty good card. Whether or not it will see play will depend on the sort of decks we see come out of the new expansion. Next up, let's take a look at a neutral legendary minion called the Undertaker, and I really like this card. It costs 8 mana, has 8 attack and 5 health, and it has the battle cry of gain the death rattle effects of 3 friendly minions that died this game. So it's an extremely good value play if you're playing in a deck with any kind of death rattles. If you're playing 1 or 2 death rattles, then it can be really good. If you're playing 3, even better, because you can target the certain death rattles that you want. The problem with that sort of play is it's very slow. So if you play this on turn 8, then the effects don't happen until the minion dies. So it is a slow card. It's not as good as N'Zoth, which we don't need to compared to because it's rotated out of the game. But that was very good at the time because it had the battle cry of summoning minions. This doesn't do anything the turn that you play it. Now you can make it do something the turn that you play it by playing it with some Death Rattle activators. So you could neutralize it in Druid. You could play Dead. Unfortunately, Terrascale Stalker wouldn't be able to be played on the same turn without the coin, but it's another way that you could do that. So without those kind of activators, though, it does need to go into a very specific kind of Death Rattle deck. I don't think you could put this into a deck like I really don't think that Death Rattle Hunter would play this because it's a little bit slow. Yes, summoning 5/5 dinosaurs would be really good when you play this, but it's not as good as what Kathrina Winterwisp is, for example. So when you play Kathrina, it draws a beast out of your deck. We know the benefits of that, and then when it dies, you get another one. And that's just better because the turn that you play Kathrina, something happens, and the turn it dies, something happens. This gets 3 things happening when it dies, but you do need to make it die or activate it. But there are some really cool interactions with this, and don't get me wrong, I think this card will be a good card in the future of the game. I think there will be certain decks that play this. But where I think it could be really cool is in Druid. You can obviously use it as another Hadronox. Maybe that's not cool to some people, but also in Druid, you could use it with the Astral Tiger. So Astral Tiger has a death rattle of shuffle this minion into your deck, so that would be quite cool because then you can get the Undertaker again, play him again, shuffle him back into your deck and keep playing him. Also a little bit of a buff to Myra Rotspring, a card that I really wanted to be good but hasn't quite been good yet because you could discover him off of Myra Rotspring and then she gets the effect and he has the effect that you can play later, so that's pretty cool. You can bounce him back to your hand to play multiple times. So we've seen the Priest card, the Seance, that can do that because it's on the same turn because it's turn 8. Rogue could obviously do it with the Shadow Steps, for example. So that's lots of cool little ways you can do it. Where I think this card will be very good and where I will definitely be trying it is in the Egg Paladin deck that you play with the Mosheannounce Egg. Now that deck is a little bit slower and it generates lots of value from resummoning the eggs. And one of the main weaknesses of the Undertaker is if you play this on turn 8 and then your opponent silences it, that's really not a good play at all. But you can say that loads of cards are weak to silence. Your opponent can't silence everything that you play. So if you're playing Mosheannounce Egg, they would love to silence that. If you play Spike Ridge Steed on something, they would love to silence that. If you play Lanessa, they would love to silence that. If you play the Undertaker, they'd love to silence that. When you play Kangor's Endless Army, you're bringing all your eggs back, they would love to silence them. They can't silence them all. So if they're holding their silence in their hand until you play the Undertaker, well, then it means they're not silencing everything else. So I think this would be a cool card to play in there. Because it just generates more value going to help you to beat those longer decks. Whether or not you actually need to generate that value is a different story, but I love these kind of cards. I really like the slower Death Rattle decks because N'Zoth was one of my favourite cards at the time, so I really hope we can make this one work, but I don't think it's going to be specifically as powerful as it first seems. Next up, let's take a look at a neutral epic minion. This one's called Linecracker. It's 7 mana, it has 5 attack and 10 health, and it does have Overkill, and the Overkill effect is double this minion's attack. Now, apologies guys, I did get the Overkill wrong in the previous video. Thank you for pointing it out. I do know how Overkill works, I just completely missed it in that instance. But here, you do need to kill a minion with 4 or less health to get the Overkill triggered. And the effect of that, though, is pretty strong. Doubling your attack potentially means you could get a 7 mana 10/10, but the problem is you play it on the first turn, it doesn't do anything unless you can give it rush. Rocket Boots can give it rush, Houndmaster Shaw could give it rush, those could be good things. But if you don't do that, then it's just a 7 mana 5/10 that goes on the board. It could work really well in a class that could heal it, so Priest could do quite well with this. Also, if you played Lady in White, when it beforehand, when it comes out, it would be a 7 mana 10/10 that gets doubled to 20 with Overkill. So some pretty cool synergies with it. I just think it's too slow to be able to play it, and really getting doubling the Overkill effect is usually only useful if you want to hit your opponent in the face. And to do that, you have to trade it in one. You have to have it sit on the board for one turn, then you have to trade it, then the next turn you have to hit your opponent's face with it. So I don't know, unless you can buff it, put Divine Spirit on it or something, I'm not sure this will be too great. Next up, we've got a neutral epic minion called Mosheannounce. This card it's alright. I don't really like these sort of cards, but it's 5 mana, has 6 attack and 5 health, and enemies attacking this have a 50% chance to attack someone else. So from your point of view, this is quite a good card to buff because the 50% chance means that it's got a bit more survivability than other minions that you might play. It might also force your opponent to play some hard removal with spells, which is good for you because then they can't use it on your bigger minions. So that's kind of the uses, but I hate playing against these cards, and I hate playing the cards because it's just a 50% chance, and you always know it's going to go the wrong way. But like, in the certain instance when this is on the board, your opponent's not going to be too keen to trade their minions into this because they do have a 50% chance of either hitting themselves, hitting one of their other minions, or hitting your face or one of your other minions. So, I don't know. I don't think many people are going to play this, but it could be quite good if you can then buff it, because it just has better survivability than other cards. Next up, we have Mark of the Loa. This is a rare spell for Druid. It costs 4 mana, and I think this card is a bit meh. Choose one, give a minion +2 attack and 4 health and taunt, or summon 2 3/2 raptors. So the buff, let's start with the buff. The buff actually isn't that bad for 4 mana, but instead of playing this card, you just want to play Saronite Chain Gang, to be honest. That is going to rotate out very soon after this expansion, so that is a good point. But while that's around, you don't want to play Mark of the Loa, I don't think. We've already seen that Druid can double the health of that beast, so maybe you would use it in that instance. Summoning 2 3/2 raptors as well for 4 mana is okay. It's kind of 6 attack, 4 health of stats that you would put onto the board, but they are quite easily killed because they're only 2 health. The raptors would also be beasts, so they work against your Witching Hour synergies. So at the moment, I don't really see this as being very good. I think it's just a middle of the road kind of spell for Druid. It might see play in a certain deck, but none of the decks that Druid play right now, I think, would want to play this. Next up, we've got a neutral epic minion called Snapjaw Shellfighter. It costs 5 mana, 3 attack, and 8 health. So actually, those stats aren't too bad for a 5 mana minion, except that the attack is pretty weak. So really, if you're playing this, you're only wanting to play this to protect one of your adjacent minions. And actually, it could have a pretty good effect. Let's say you've got a taunt minion on the board that you really want to stick around. Well, if you play this next to your taunt minion, your opponent can't hurt this unless they can get past the taunt, obviously, and your taunt minion gets an extra 8 health. That can be pretty good in specific instances. We talked about the Druid card just previously, Mark of the Loa. You could potentially play a big minion on the board if it survives. Next turn you play Mark of the Loa on it, give it taunt and an extra 4 health, and then you play Shellfighter and it gets another 8 health. That could be a way that you could use it to keep this big minion around, to keep hammering your opponent in the face. But honestly, this is kind of a neutral epic card which would be quite cool to discover in certain instances. Sometimes you might discover it and think, oh, this would work really well. But outside of that, putting it into your deck seems very strange. There might be some cool combos or some reasons why you would want to give it to minions. Perhaps the Loas or your spirits are quite nice to keep around. Maybe you would want to do that. But otherwise, your opponent can trade into this quite nicely because it's only got 3 attack. So unless you're protecting it with a taunt, it might be quite easy to remove. Alright guys, that's all the cards I've got to show you for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.